Hello, all.
Hello.
So we got our friend Mike Muldowney, the nerd in the north, here with me
That's me.
today. Got a couple of nerds out. Uh, Matthew is still away on training, and unfortunately, Jeff is a little under the weather. So
Boo.
Mike was nice enough to help me out today. It looks like we might be having some.
Still got some dinner to finish up.
There you go. Looks like we might have some difficulties showing up on Facebook, so I'm not sure if it is on Facebook. We are live on YouTube. So if anybody watching, maybe you can throw up a post in the group just saying that if you're looking for the live, maybe check us out on YouTube because it looks like it's not connected to Facebook for some reason. So
I didn't know StreamYard gave you that kind of feedback.
Yeah, as soon as I went live, it was kind of giving me this big warning here on the top of the screen saying it's not connected to Facebook. So not sure what's going on there.
I'll hop over into the group right now and I'll take care of it.
Awesome. So catch a couple of people here. We have Mark saying let's go. We have TMG Custom Design. Hello, nerds and others. So yeah, it might be a little bit quiet today if people don't find us along YouTube.
A lot of replay squad this time.
Yeah, exactly. We have Jesse coming in saying hi, Justin. So yeah, hopefully people will find us today. Again, if you're watching from YouTube, we are having some problems with Facebook for some reason. So good evening from North Central Minnesota, from the cold country, I'm sure. But yeah, we are going to explore and talk about. I know it's always a bone of contention and troublesome trying to do small lettering when it comes to embroidery. I kind of look at it as when it comes to lettering and embroidery, it's one of those things where it's your eye is drawn to that first. You're going to read whatever the design says. So I think it's something that gets more attention in a design. So of course your eye's going to go to it. It's gonna see flaws in it if it's gonna be there. You know, a design that's more intricate, that has a lot going on, a little flaw here and there, especially when it comes to embroidery and you're working with thread in garments and in different substrates. A little flaw here and there in an embroidery design is kind of a given, and it's not going to be as easily recognized. But text is one of those things where just something off a little bit, it's going to be seen, especially with people that are a little bit closer attention to detail. So it is something that it's kind of difficult to get perfect every single time, especially when it comes to small lettering. So looks like we got a bunch of people checking in here. I'm just going to go over before we get rolling.
Yeah, there is a lot of people trying to say hi.
Yeah, we got Eddie Jr., we have Ramona. Hi, Ramona. Thanks for joining us. Cindy King, good evening. And we got a lot of hellos back and forth between the audience here. Kingsbury Crafts saying hi. Okay, so yeah, small lettering. I'm gonna take you through some pointers and some tricks of the trade that I've learned over the years. Unfortunately, because we don't have Jeff here tonight, we won't be able to show you in Pulse, but I'm going to take you through in Wilcom and possibly Hatch as well if we have time, which are real similar, but we'll explore both softwares and take a look at some small lettering. Like I was saying, lettering is one of those things where, you know, if you're taking something like a fill stitch with a satin outline in a design, you may digitize that the same way, whether it's something it's an inch or something that's 3 inches. There's not much that's going to change in the way to approach digitizing when it comes to something like that. Lettering, I think it's pretty much it. A lot of things changes if you're going to something that's, you know, typically I try to keep things no smaller than 5 millimeters tall. It's kind of my go to small size if you want to ensure legible, readable lettering. Not to say that you can't go smaller than that, but I think that's the safe zone before you start running into problems. Fonts are another thing that you really want to pay attention to. Something that's a really, really thin font is not going to work well as a small lettering. Kind of the more basic, more straightforward fonts that don't have a lot of serifs, a lot of filigree as far as, real ornamental designs like some scripts get into. Less is more when it comes to small lettering, I guess what I'm saying. But yeah, there's a lot of things that change as far as densities, underlays, pull compensation, push compensation that change quite a bit depending on what size lettering you're working with. So
would you say, Justin, that you make a concerted effort to get customers to maybe consider a slight design modification before you go to that sub 6 millimeter extent?
Yeah, there's definitely when an order comes in, I'll take a quick peek at it just to make sure that there's nothing that's really standing out, like lettering that's going to be 2 millimeters tall or something like that, or a bunch of lettering that they want to shove into a small little area, especially working on a hat or something like that. And there's definitely, I sent out 2 or 3 quotes today saying, all right, if you want this on a hat, it's not going to work as per your artwork. Here's other modifications that we can do, short of omitting lettering altogether. One of them it's one of those ones where it's got the name of the company, it's got a tagline, then it's got a phone number. It's like, what information do you really need on this hat? Do you need the phone number? Yeah. So yes, it's absolutely. I usually come back and say, and it's one of those things where it's like right off the bat, I know the changes that need to be done in order to make the space to make that lettering work. This is the best possible scenario for your embroidery to look clean. Now let's go to the what can and can't be modified in the design. So, yeah, I think it's one of those things where a lot of people either have it's a corporate design type thing in rules that they can't change, or people are dead set and heart set on having information involved in their design. But yeah, there's a little back and forth, just making sure that we can get the
hats are not business cards.
Exactly. We got Frank checking in, and he's pointing out Mike's new hat.
Actually, these are the hats I wear all the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Baseball caps are not the norm for me these days.
No, those in what are the toques?
No, toques. That's toques or something totally different here. Yeah, no, it is toque weather outside right now, but yeah, baseball caps. I only actually started wearing them more when I got into this embroidery thing, because then I had something cool to wear. But I've been rocking the fedora for a while. I don't know, fits me. Looks a little bit smarter out on the road, I think, sometimes for a grown up.
Yeah, you look sharp. You look sharp.
Thanks for pointing it out, Frank. I appreciate it.
All right, let's get into it. So I got just the general ABCD here going, but kind of the types of things that I was pointing out that are going to range as far as things you need to take a look at and kind of know what needs to be adjusted. This text right now is set to 5 millimeters tall. So, knowing that things like push compensation, where the ends of these satins are going to be pushing out this way, down, left or right, depending on the letter, at 5 millimeters tall, measuring this gap that's between these two letters is a 0.5 millimeter thick, or a 0.5 millimeter wide. So of course, dealing with this small scale, knowing that push is going to be at least a 0.5 millimeter. If you were to digitize, going exactly off the exact art, these ends are going to be pushing into the next letter. So you're going to have a lot of letters that are going to be running together. It's not going to look clean.
Yeah.
It's going to be a run-on word.
You're talking about distances the width of one thread at this point.
Exactly. So yeah, at this scale, that's definitely something that you are going to have to be paying attention to next to. For instance, if you were to say knock this up to an inch tall, now that gap now between those letters is almost 2 3/4 wide millimeters. So of course that compensates. Yeah. So exactly. At this point, you as a digitizer, depending on or as an embroiderer, even depending on how I have the two schools of thought. People want the machine to do the work so they don't have any cleanup afterwards, or they want the machine keep on running as smooth as possible without stop, so they choose to trim it by hand after the embroidery is done. So at this scale, you see the gaps between the letters. Now you don't have to use as much push comp, because that gap's going to be there no matter what. You decide if you're going to add trims between every letter, or if you're going to want to manually trim, so you can set settings to make sure that it doesn't trim. So just so you can see that scale from 5 millimeters to an inch tall, just in scale, this font changes quite a bit as far as what you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
So on as well as push from side to side as far as letter spacing, knowing that the satin stitches are going to be pulling away from each other when you're running parallel to each other. These gaps like this, you're not going to have to worry about too much compensation, because that they're going to pull away from each other. When you're getting into areas where you're going to have enclosed areas like the center of the A, or the inner parts of the B, or even lowercase letters like E's and A's and whatnot. That's another area that you do have to worry about trying to opening up, because a couple of things are going to happen when you're trying to embroider, leaving small little voids. Depending on the material, there is times where embroidering around that small little area, you can tear the garment itself, because you're putting so much tension on all around all sides, having that really, really small area basically hanging on by a thread, if you will. That little area is taking on a lot of needle penetration, so it could rip the garments. Just letters closing in on each other, having that embroidery circling such a small area with the push and pull and the fabric moving, the letters fall into each other and it's just a big blob. So that's another thing that you need to be aware of.
Stabilizer makes a big difference when you're doing small lettering?
I think it can, depending on the garment. I mean, there's definitely, if you're trying to use a tearaway, one sheet of tearaway stabilizer, and the material you're going on is not stable in itself, that's a lot of pulling that's going to be going on.
It's giving you no help whatsoever.
It's giving there's no stabilization at all. There's times where certain hats, we had a situation where we were having a heck of a time with a design with small lettering around the seam area, and the seam being thick as it was, on top of using backing, and we actually were experimenting no backing, clipping the hats, not clipping the hats, and we found that particular hat without backing worked better. It sewed better. There was less thread breaks, less needle breaks, because it was eliminating just that much more layer to sew through, trying to sew that small lettering on top of the seam. So it can affect it. Yes, absolutely.
That would definitely be an exception, not a rule.
Exactly. Exactly. Things, again, this is working with a 5 millimeter text, which is typically my minimum that I go for. But things like to open up those areas to make sure that the voided enclosed areas aren't going to be a problem. Things like what I usually do is I will digitize to the art itself, and then you'll actually make adjustments like move that crossbar down a little bit in that design. And what that does is this is going to make this inner part area larger, so you don't have those sides so close together. And when sewn out and you have that pull in with this satin, it is going to make that crossbar a little bit thinner. You're going to have a push from the bottom of the satin. So yes, on screen it doesn't look right. It looks a little off, but once sewn, it's going to sew into place and leave that opening in that A a lot better. So
this is where you start. This is where you start playing some mind games too, right? Like if you make it look like an A, most people's brains are gonna see it as an A.
Exactly.
Even though it's not 100% true to the textbook version of an A.
Exactly. And like the quote that Eric always says, if it looks correct on screen, it's never going to sew correctly out. So and there's times where I provide a PDF sample of the design along with the finished DST file or whatever embroidery file that I provide. And a lot of customers, especially if they're new to embroidery, they'll take a look at the design on the PDF without sewing it out, and they see this lettering to their eyes is up and down as far as height of the letters, because they're seeing the compensation that I do for the push and pull of letters, but they're not realizing that once sewn, all these areas pushing and pulling is gonna hopefully even out to a straight line. So
yeah, I think this is also a good illustration of how to manage expectations here too. That one object you've drawn is, according to the bottom corner, is 25 stitches.
Correct.
So that's what, 26 needle penetrations in an object that is 2 millimeters by 3/4 of a millimeter.
Yes.
So we are stabbing a piece of metal through a garment 26 times in a 1 millimeter square area. And
exactly.
People think nothing weird is supposed to happen.
and that brings up a perfectly good another point that I wanted to touch is not only are you need to worry about a factor like push and pull being such a different factor between something that's small to larger lettering, but also the density. It kind of works as you go up in size of lettering. You're going to want to add density, which density is the spacing between each stitch. So the larger you go up in size on any element, as far as satin stitches, you're going to want to increase the density to make sure that there's proper coverage and it's not going to look too thin or have garment showing through. Density is an underlay. The bigger you go, the more you want. The smaller you go, the less you want. When Mike pointed out that there's 25 stitches in this small little area, this happened just to be set at 0.36 density. Just changing it to 0.4 reduces it down to 23 stitches. So just changing that little bit of a value of the stitch density just eliminated a couple stitches.
Yeah, like 18% or something like that. And that's
right.
That's a big deal. And like
exactly.
Ramona made a really good point. It's getting way into the weeds, but technically there's 2 threads poking out of every one of those penetrations because of the way a lock stitch is formed.
Right.
So like we're dealing with physics and heat and space. Like we're trying to jam a lot of stuff into a very, very small area.
Yeah, so that's definitely where you really want to back off your density. Again, these are kind of just general rules. Depending on what garment you're working with, there may be an adjustment here and there. You want to go a little bit more density or a little less density. working with specialty threads like metallics, that's going to throw another wrench in the idea. But yeah, so working with really, really small lettering, 5 millimeters and even less. Again, less is more. You're not trying to jam as much density as you possibly can, thinking, oh, more density is more coverage. It's going to be nice full lettering. No, you're going to run into more problems. You're going to run into thread breaks, needle breaks, depending on how thick your garment is. And you got to remember too, a thread break, the fact that your machine is stopped, your thread breaks. Now you're gonna have to. It's gonna be inching, trying to get that thread caught in stabilized by your bobbin. That might start another knot in that area, and these little quirks that are going to be amplified in these small little areas. If there's a stitch out of place, it's going to throw off that letter.
Yeah. And God forbid it's black on white or white on black. It's
exactly
those high contrast situations just exacerbate all of this even more.
Exactly. So instead of kind of a finesse approach where it's just enough amount of stitches to get the coverage, but it's going to form those letters, kind of like what Mike was saying earlier. As long as your eye recognizes it as a letter, it's not way too under density as far as the shirt showing through, but just enough to form that letter to get a nice clean sewn letter is what you're really looking for. So yeah, those areas there are kind of tricks where to trying to open up that kind of A. Another thing I like doing is in Wilcom, most digitizing systems that I've ever used, they have some type of guide system. With these rulers on the side, you can actually pull in a guide by just clicking on the ruler, and it'll give you a guide that you can move up and down. What I typically do is I'll set a guide at the very top and bottom of my letters. So it gives me the horizontal lines that's going to give me an even line throughout my whole word, given that the lettering is in a perfectly straight line. Then I'll actually come in and I will drop another guide where I'm basically setting my guides to where I want my letters to shorten up to compensate for the push. Again, speaking of earlier, you're not going to have too much compensation that needed when you're working with larger lettering, because that one thread thickness that it may push out is not going to be as evident when you're working in a larger scale, but on a shorter scale or a smaller scale, it's going to be pretty evident. So what I usually do to see how much of that compensation I need to make is I usually go ahead and
so you take your starting nodes right to the proper baseline. You don't plan on that leading thread getting pushed back a little bit.
So what I do is just to see how much compensation that I need, I'll go ahead and go to the artwork, to the extreme top and bottom, and see where I'm at as far as, I set my stitch count or my density to 0.4, which is pretty average on something that's 5 millimeters. It's typically what works for 5 millimeters. But I will use that to kind of see where my stitches are as far as that spacing between the two stitches. And my rule of thumb is I usually go halfway between the stitches is where I'm going to set my compensation. So basically half the density. And once I get those lines established, I know throughout that's going to be my guide to use as my points to plot. So you can see that there's stop short top and bottom because that's my guide. So if I'm going to come in here and digitize the B, and because the top and bottom of the B aren't pushing out and they're actually going to be running parallel to the horizontal line, we know that they're going to actually pull in to those letters, the top and bottom. So you have the compensation on the A where it stops short, which is going to be pushing out. The letters like B, C, and D, they're going to be pulling in. So we know that pulling in, pushing the other ones, that's the happy medium that you're going to try to find to make sure your letters are even when sewn.
Yeah. Do you leave your pull comp set at your default even at this size, or do you scale it back a little bit?
No, I do scale it back a little bit because because I looked like I had it at 0.22 the last time I used it. So again, it's one of those things where you use pull compensation to make sure that, you know, when you're digitizing something to the lettering, if you had no pull compensation, if a letter's 1.5 millimeters wide as far as the thickness of the stroke of the letter, then it is going to be pulled in and it's going to look a lot skinnier when sewn. Again, thinking to yourself, I want something bold, it's more density, more pull compensation is the first thinking to go to. The happy medium, again, because you are trying to avoid these areas to be filled in too much and really weaken that material in here. As you can see with the pull compensation, this solid line is actually the line that I actually digitized on. You can see there. And with the pull compensation, that's how much compensation that those satin stitches are getting wider. So you definitely want to back off that a little bit as well when you are working with small lettering.
Do I see some short stitches in there too? Short stitching is turned on in there?
Yep.
Yeah.
I have the shortening settings on, so to make sure that when it comes around a letter, you have short stitches on to when there's a certain radius when satins turn, instead of if you imagine coming to the inside and then going to the outside. Of course, the inside is going to be less of a path as far as the surface area. So if you have the same amount of needle penetrations on the inside of the curve, which is the smaller area, it's going to definitely bunch up the stitches more on the inside. So yes, that is definitely an area that you're going to have short stitches to compensate for that bunching up on the inside of that letter.
And that also helps with the density situation, because that puts some of those penetrations in different spots. Even though it's the same number, it offsets them a little bit.
Exactly. So yeah, as far as the finesse of something that's at 5 millimeters tall, the density is something you're going to really want to focus on. The pull and push compensation as you're digitizing. There are some softwares out there that have a push compensation setting. Wilcom, I don't think does. I tend to avoid those though, because in my experience, the software that I have used those in the past, it seemed like it was a one size fits all amount that it compensated, and it didn't really take into account the size of the lettering or the size of the element you were doing.
It's just a toggle, not so much a setting.
Exactly. So as far as push, I definitely do that manually, depending on the size of the lettering. The pull compensation typically is in most softwares. Again, it's either a percentage or an actual value. I know on Pulse you could actually use percentage wise, or you can actually put an actual value. The difference between these two that in Wilcom, if you adjust column width, where you're actually telling it to make the column width wider, then it's actually when you're dealing with a lot more underlay, like edge runs or zigzags or something like that, the adjust column width will actually adjust the underlay as well with it. So if you adjusted it a whole millimeter wider to make something bolder, that means your underlay is going to go with it. Just using the pull compensation value up here, all that it's going to do is going to widen your top stitch, widen your satin. It's not going to affect your underlay at all. So those are the two pull compensation options that you have in Wilcom. Looks like Ramona pointed out that Floriana and Pulse both do adjust to the settings regardless of the element to adjust. It's good to know. Thank you, Ramona. When you are working with stock text, block 2 is kind of one of the ones that I feel that Wilcom has done well with. As you can see, if the stock underlay that was set already on this stock text was edge run along with a zigzag underlay. If you can and if you can imagine looking at the needle penetrations, let's see, at 5 millimeters tall with that much underlay, it's crazy. Trying to jam that many stitches. Just this letter at 5 millimeters tall and 4 millimeters wide is almost 1,000 stitches.
Oh man!
So if you want thread breaks and needle breaks, go for it.
There's how to do it.
That's how to do it.
And loops everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Loops and underlay sticking out. So typically, if I am going to use the underlay setting, that's for the computer to decide, it's going to definitely be a center walk. And that's where it's just doing one line of stitches underneath your satin stitch to help stabilize the material, to make sure that your satin stitches are going to be raising off the material. Another thing you want to pay attention to is the actual stitch length, to make sure that, especially coming around corners on small lettering, you want to set your stitch length to something lower. And what that is basically the stitch length is the needle penetration of how close those stitches are going to be as it travels throughout your letter. If you set it to something extremely long, what's going to happen is you're going to have less needle penetration. So, going around a curve, you may not have a tight enough distance between those, so it may be sticking out of that top stitches by the time you're done. This is real apparent on hats, because working with that curved surface, throwing in everything else that you have to worry about on hats. If you don't have that underlay, making sure that it's really going down that center of that satin stitch and it's kind of tight and compact, you're going to have that stitch that's here and there flying out from underneath that letter. That's kind of the idea of, I never use edge walk or edge run underlay on a hat, no matter what size of the letter, because it's going to tend to, at one point or another, it's going to be sticking out outside that letter.
They are a good way to trick people into cleaning their machine, though. Like, why am I getting so many loops? Oh, your machine must be dirty. You got to just in there.
There you go.
Clean it up. It's dirty.
So Ramona did ask a question, Justin. Wouldn't the stitch length minimum setting take care of that? In the very run length, yes. There's times where I just speak in general terms, Ramona, and not specifically to Wilcom, but Wilcom does have the setting where it does give you the variable run length in the core gap. So it does take into consideration going around curves. So it'll almost stutter step to make sure that it goes around a curve in a way that it can, to make sure that it doesn't have any longer stitches sticking out. So Wilcom does have that setting as well.
But you would have to, that's a minimum length, right? So you would have to take that down even further if you were experiencing it still being
correct. Exactly. let's see the needle point. So like right now,
are there
you can
diminishing
see-
returns, Justin, in reducing the length of that run stitch? Like
that's another thing too. It's when it comes to small lettering, it's really that balance. Because if someone were to say like, oh, we may see that question in the group where a picture of a hat and say, why am I getting these stitches sticking out from underneath the satin stitch? And one of us may say, oh, shorten your stitch length of your underlay. Well, it's kind of a general rule, and that's given that the array that you're working with of your minimum and maximum that you should be working with. And going too far and having that where there's less than a quarter of a millimeter between every stitch, you're going to start running into thread breaks and needle breaks then, where you have too many close stitches and small stitches that are going to cause problems as well.
Is there ever a condition where you would just forego underlay completely?
I've done it. I don't advise it. I think something needs at least a running stitch. But more than not, I think the problem is if you allow the computer to choose, especially if you're doing closest connection and you're telling the computer, all right, I want these two letters to be closest connection. I want it to be a start here and end here. I want it to have a center walk underlay. It's gonna choose the best possible path to take. So it may run that underlay over itself a couple times in order to get to an end of a satin stitch to start. So yes, if you are having problems with smaller lettering, even using the proper settings of a center walk, I typically will then go ahead and manually digitize my underlay using either a running or a manual stitch. Yeah. That way I can control exactly where it's going to go. Yeah. And I actually may forego, for instance, you can see, slow this down. Oh, that's got all kinds of crazy underlay on the A. But on the B, if you could see, if it's, I'm sitting here pointing at my screen. It's going to start at the bottom left corner of the B. It's going to walk up to the center of the B, walk back down over itself, and walk up and around to this section of the B here to start in order to come around. And again, because it's ending this side of the B to be closest connection, it chose to walk back over itself for a third time in order for it to, and let's see, that's even doing something weird. It decided to walk over itself a fourth time to start the satin and come back around and choose its path. So it is choosing kind of a weird path where it's going over itself 4 times in order to complete that satin and end over there.
Yeah, I've noticed that the computer doesn't remember that it just put a travel stitch where it then wants to put
exactly. And that's where, especially with working with 3D Puff, of course, 3D Puff isn't going to be lettering this small, but I actually will digitize everything manually. 3D Puff is an area where you're trying to avoid as much underlay as possible, but your travel stitches are going to, if there has to be a bridge or something like that, your travel stitches are going to be involved in that element that you're trying to add. But yeah, I mean, these softwares are definitely come a long way, are very intuitive and have a lot of great tools to them. But when you are working on extremes and lettering, small lettering being such a problematic thing, there's a lot of times where you want to digitize things manually. So for instance, if I were to take off that altogether, I'm going to break this so it's not lettering, and say I do want closest join. So closest join being that I want the A to end here, I want the B to end here, and that way it's the closest join is going to be the closest spot to the next letter. So basically, that jump stitch is non-existent. You don't need to trim it. The machine doesn't need to trim it, and to the eye, it's not going to be really seen. So I may choose to these needle penetrations. I may choose to go ahead and digitize my own underlay. So knowing that this is going to probably want to start on this end of the satin, work its way around, stop here, walk back over itself to start the satin here and end here. I may opt to go ahead and digitize just the manual underlay there. Make sure it starts there. And so if you can see, by doing that, I am only having the underlay on that left and top section of the B. It starts at satin. And knowing that it's going to stop at this point and move to the center of the B on its own to finish that satin, that travel stitch actually becomes its own underlay. And the only part of that B that doesn't have the underlay is just this back side. And working with smaller text, especially sub 5 millimeter, I'd rather have a small piece of that letter that may not have a piece of underlay than trying to go over it itself too many times like it did earlier with the manual or the computer generated underlay. Because again, you got to remember too, when you're working with sub small lettering and you start getting into the 60 weight thread, there's times where your column width is barely wider than that width of a thread. So if you think about it, is your underlay is that single width of a thread, and you're planning on putting that satin stitch over that. If it's barely as wide, you have a good chance of, if you have several layers of that underlay, it's going to start laying on top of each other and push one way or another and start sticking out.
Yeah.
So now getting into extremely small lettering.
Extremely small.
Extremely small. Let's take it down to 4 millimeters.
Oh.
just the sound that Mike gives is enough said. So getting into lettering that's sub 5 millimeters is definitely a tricky thing to do. But if there's times where it is information or design that someone may want there, but they know that it may not be completely legible, and of course, kind of like the handshake away, or in the new world, the social distancing distance away, it's definitely lettering that's not going to be readable from where you're at. It's one of those things where it has to be part of the logo for one reason or another. And of course, you want it to be somewhat recognizable where it just doesn't look like a pile of stitches. So this is where I kind of incorporate where I really want to make sure that I am digitizing underlay manually, because you don't want any chance of it going over itself several different times like it did in that B. That was a great example of how the computer can choose some wacky things sometimes. But just looking at the stitches here, you could see that this is even moving that crossbar down like I did earlier. This is leaving pretty much a non-existent gap in the A.
Yeah.
So
in that case, you are relying on the pull of the stitch to create that gap.
Right.
On screen, it looks like a blob. In real life, it's gonna.
So at this size, I actually take it even further. I'm going to go ahead and adjust the density So at 0.4, like I was doing at 5 millimeter, it is, in my opinion, that is giving a little bit too much density in such a small area. At 0.4, I'm usually at 0.445 to 0.7, somewhere in there, depending on the garment. And you can see on screen the difference between, it does look kind of like a zipper effect where it looks like those stitches are open. Yeah. And it looks like the garment's going to be showing through. But again, working in such a small scale, having that less density, you know those stitches are going to be pushing together in such a small little area. You want the least amount of needle penetrations in that small area. So what I do with extreme cases like that, anywhere I can, again, just trying to create the shape of the letter is mainly what you're going for. So I'll actually use running stitches for areas of the letters just to make sure I'm using the minimal amount of width to create that element. Mm-hmm. This is barring not going to straight running stitch lettering, and that, in my opinion, that's kind of like the end all be all choice, that if you have to have a word, it's just too small to embroider satins. Running stitch lettering is just one of those things where it just has to be there, and it will resemble the word that you're trying to do, or the letters that you're trying to do.
So what you've done there for the bar in that A is the exact same principle that makes Lee Caroselli's shading work. Those two stitches don't lay one on top of the other. By the time that second stitch goes down, it falls off to the side.
Exactly.
Starts to spread out.
So so basically, I'm trying to use that running stitch. It's starting on one side, going to the other, working its way back. So you have two stitches that are falling on top of each other that will fall side by side. So again, working with the minimum width of a stitch going back on itself is going to kind of give you, it's going to open up that area. So even lowering it even more on there, it's going to give you that gap.
Ramona asked a question that I think I can partially answer for you.
Okay.
Yeah, she says if you digitized 4 millimeter or less using standard 7511 and 40 weight, and I can tell you for certain that he's done it at least once, because he did it for me on a patch that we had no choice. There was a special color,
yes,
and certain size of text that I couldn't go get 60 weight thread in this particular gold, and very stringent requirements.
Typically, I will have that in mind no matter what, just because 40 weight and 75 are the standard. Unless a customer tells me specifically that I'm planning on using 60 weight, and that's where, when a customer is ordering a design from me, as much information as possible kind of gives me, the more information flood me, and that way I know exactly what you're working with, what the garment is, what thread you have. So I can digitize to those specifics. Yes, I would, 60 weight being a lighter gauge thread. So of course it's not going to cover as much. So me using that 0.45, 0.47 density to lighten up the density, that's kind of keeping in mind that it's going to be 40 weight thread. You actually want to add a little bit more density if you are going to a 60 weight thread, just to compensate for that thickness of the thread. But it is definitely going to give you a little bit more wiggle room using a smaller needle like a 65 and a 60 weight thread, trying to get a little bit more detail in those small areas.
But there are cases where it's just not an option.
Yeah, exactly. Especially, I know a lot of embroiderers, they'll keep the standard white and black as far as 60 weight in house, just because that's the most two popular colors used. But if you have your wall of 50 different colors ranging from reds and golds and blues and greens, are you going to keep 60 weight thread in all those different colors?
It's not even available in all those.
Exactly.
I think out of the 300 Ganold poly 40s, there's maybe 25% of that or less is available in 60 weight.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I haven't checked the actual numbers, and I could be off, but it is certainly not Not all of them. It's probably it's far less than half. I'd have to count them, but yeah, it's just I would rather encourage somebody to allow some modifications than go to 60 weight thread.
Right.
Just because in my shop, if I'm switching to 60 weight thread, then I'm switching that on 12 heads. I'm switching out 12 needles. I'm doing all this other stuff, and I don't want to do all that. I just want to
exactly. So
the stuff on my machine.
It's the number of threads you have. It's the number of heads you have. Sometimes it's just not economical to go through all that work to try to set up your machine to try to get that better look. You kind of work your way from the get-go and say, what modifications can I do to the design to make it so better?
Yeah, it's easy to talk about all the twists and tricks you can do when you're talking about a one-head shop, and it's your only machine, and you got lots of time to figure out what to do and play with all the different variables. But sometimes when you get into production, you just don't have time to mess with all that. So it's easier to just work with what you got and even kind of steer customers away from certain things.
And you got to remember that customer 99.999% of the time isn't going to know all those options that as an embroiderer, they walk in, you look at it and you could say, yeah, I could probably pull that lettering off if I had 60 weight and I wanted to change out my needles. And it's, I could, but let's take a different approach that's going to be working with my production on how I'm not going to adjust. It's still going to look good. You're not going to just try to throw out crap because you're being lazy. Right. You're trying to, in best case scenario for your production, to give them that pricing that you're giving them. Because you're not changing your whole setup being 15 minutes to 45 minutes now because you're changing out cones, you're changing out needles, just to get a slight difference in the embroidery.
Yeah, I'm trying to sell a quality embroidered cap. I'm not trying to sell quality embroidered 4mm text.
Right.
I've got an overall picture to sell, not some of these fine details. So it's tough sometimes because some people get stuck on things, but you're tripping over dollars to pick up dimes. Exactly.
In that same vein, as far as using the running or manual stitches to try to open up that area, before you had that middle crossbar and the E that really created that crowding in between the two top and bottom. So I'm going to use that as well as the E as well, opening up that area. Again, once sewn, that running stitch going over itself twice is going to kind of give it a little bit of width. It's not going to be too much different than those satins after they pull in. So again, your eye seeing a well-defined form letter is going to be a lot better than something that's the exact thickness throughout and kind of start crowding. Another thing that I know we're running out of time here that I wanted to point out, but even the angles of your satins can affect small lettering quite a bit more than working with something that's a little bit bigger. But as you can see, and again, this is pulled from a stock font. They tend to take their corners pretty sharp 90 degrees whenever there's a 90-degree turn. But just the angles, if you can see, the orange squares being the angle lines here. It's a perfectly vertical. Then you have one going across it at 45 degrees, and then another one that's perfectly horizontal. So it's turning this corner quite a bit. So just even adjusting your angles a bit, so it kind of takes those corners a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah, unless the customer is getting down there with a loop, looking at these things through magnifying glass, they're not going to notice that you carried that angle a little further towards the middle of the letter.
Exactly, and again, this isn't always for aesthetic pleasing to the eye, even though it can be. But oops, I'm going to show you the difference between the two. It's also the needle penetration, so your machine's running more efficiently.
Yeah.
But something angled, as you can see, the angle differences between the one that's turning completely. Change that back to.
Yeah. These are a lot of the same principles, like you mentioned before, that we use in 3D foam to keep inside corners from getting too dense, to play with those angles so that the changes aren't so extreme.
Exactly.
Underlay poking out, it's very similar, albeit for a completely different result.
Cindy is saying, don't most digitizers take into account the mostly using 40-weight thread? Yes, I would say 98, 99% of the time, my customers are using 40-weight thread. Mm-hmm. And if they're not, they're specifically telling me. There's one particular customer that ordered one today saying, just so you know, the bottom lettering is pretty small. I'm planning on having 60-weight thread for that. So to make sure that not only am I digitizing it for 60-weight, but say like it's a one color design, it's all black thread. Not only do I need to digitize that lettering for 60-weight, but I also want to put a color change in there to make sure that they have a needle for their 60-weight and a needle for the rest of the design. Yep. So yeah, there's a lot of general rules that I follow if there's not enough information, or general rules that I follow too that I know that the design's going to work, 97, 98% of the time. And if that special garment or that special thread or whatever may come up, it is a quick adjustment that I can make to a design later on if that customer is needing it. So
yeah. Cindy makes a great point. She's right. Most digitizers would stick to 40-weight as kind of a rule, but you know who doesn't is a lot of people in our community. We have a great bunch of people in the group and everything, but so many people are so quick to just switch to 60-weight. Well, I can't, or right. just do this, just do that. No, like that's not like, how do I make this better with standard materials? Without having to change my production and this, that, and the other thing. So it's just so easy to say, just switch to 60-weight. Whoa, just run bobbin thread in the top. Like, no, we can't do that.
Right, and that's it's a lot of times when those questions come up. Yes, going to the best case scenario that would fix the problem in theory may not be very. Everybody's out there doing this, and pretty much most people are out there doing this to make money. So you're trying to get something done efficiently to the best quality you possibly can, especially those houses that have those multi-head, multi-needle machines. They're not going to want to go in and change out 8 to 12 heads of cones and needles to make sure that 24 36 piece run has pinpoint precision lettering when other adjustments can be made using your standard setup. So
we're not picking on you, Ramona. I see you there. Don't worry.
But yeah, there is times where those people that have the single heads, I think there's this kind of this misconception that like the people that have the single heads or the two heads, I'm just this lowly person with a single head, and these multi-head people are so much better.
Oh yeah,
it's just different circumstances in what you're trying to do and who you're servicing, and there are those benefits. You have a single head, you can take in that one piece order. Mm-hmm. You're not tying up an 8-head that's only running one shirt, or if you want to use specialty threads. If you want to invest in something like a color reel where you're only needing it for a single head, those are benefits for having a single
color reel.
But yeah, just in this situation, changing out 60 weight thread. If you are doing only things with basic colors, you may have 3 or 4 of your needles always on 60 weight thread if you want to really focus on that small lettering or small details. So
I'm not saying that it's not a valid fix, it's not a valid solution. It absolutely is, and that's the reason they do make these items. That's why they're out there. But it's in my shop, and I'm certain I'm not alone, it's just not a viable option to hop into all that often. There's a reason there's 10 to 1 40 weight to 60 weight threads on the chart.
Right.
That's what's out there. That's the usual.
And the last thing I could say as far as small lettering, not only is the digitizing in the thread and the needles and whatnot that you're using that's going to affect what you're doing as far as small lettering, but the garment itself is going to definitely have a big play in it. You can get away with running a twill shirt with much more and cleaner, smaller lettering than you will running a beanie or running a K polo or something like that.
Yeah, anything woven.
Exactly.
Yeah, or sorry, not woven. Like it's got that thick, heavy knit.
Mm-hmm.
Some with a lot of dips and valleys and stuff. Like those stitches are just going to disappear.
Exactly.
And when you're talking about these kind of widths, even a topper like Solvay or something like that isn't going to help, because by the time that stitch is laid down, there's nothing left. There's nothing left under there, so it might as well have not even been there.
Exactly.
So,
So
one thing that I've noticed does make a difference is slowing the machine up a little bit, because it's kind of a phenomena of physics that the faster the machine's going, the tighter the stitch gets pulled, and so lightening up on the speed a little bit won't pull the stitch quite as tight, so you'll get a little bit more definition in those letters, and it won't thin up as much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So unfortunately, when it comes to small lettering, there's probably 30, 40 different things you can try to do to help it. Yeah. So, and any combination of those can possibly work with whatever particular job.
It's going to change from design to design. Like
exactly.
Every factor is different for every job.
Exactly. I mean, there's kind of those sweet spots that I've found in small lettering, just because I've been doing this so long and seeing it actually on the machine and what one will and won't work. But there's times where it's like, I may be like, oh, here's the situation where I'm going to use those combination of things that I did before, and it worked most of the time. And I have a customer coming back to me saying, it ain't working. And so I have to, go a different direction. So awesome. Well, I want to thank you again, Mike, for filling in today, since we had some people out. I appreciate it. And thank you for everybody for joining us tonight. I know we were only on YouTube tonight. It does look like Facebook never connected. So I will get our tech people on that and see if they can fix that for next week. So, but enjoy your evening, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thanks, everybody.